The sun was blazing down on the city streets when Officer Bradshaw pulled over a sleek black SUV. His eyes narrowed as he approached, already forming his opinion about the man behind the wheel. The driver, a well-dressed black man in his 40s, calmly rolled down his window, meeting the officer's gaze with quiet authority. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, but Bradshaw didn't care to answer. He had already decided this man didn't belong in a car like this. Without asking for ID, the officer's tone grew sharp. "Step out of the vehicle," he barked. The driver raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "I'd be happy to, but may I ask why?" His calm demeanor only seemed to irritate the officer more. Bradshaw yanked the door open and pulled him out roughly, ignoring the murmurs of bystanders gathering nearby. What happened next would shock everyone. Just as Bradshaw was about to escalate things further, the man reached into his coat pocket, revealing an FBI badge. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The officer's face drained of color. He had just made the biggest mistake of his career. And now karma was coming for him. The street fell silent. Officer Bradshaw's hand twitched as he stared at the FBI badge, his mind racing. He had profiled this man without a second thought, assuming he was just another civilian he could push around. But now, standing in front of him was someone with more authority than he could ever imagine. The man dusted off his coat, his expression still composed, but there was something sharp in his eyes. Something that told Bradshaw this wasn't over. Bystanders pulled out their phones, whispering among themselves. Some had already guessed what had just happened. Did he just rough up an FBI agent? One voice murmured. Others stood frozen, waiting to see what would happen next. The air was thick with tension, and Bradshaw knew he was in trouble. But instead of backing down, he clenched his jaw. "I don't care who you are," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "You are acting suspicious." The FBI agent, whose name was Samuel Carter, let out a slow breath. "Suspicious?" he repeated, tilting his head slightly. His voice was calm, but the weight behind it was heavy. "Tell me, officer, what exactly about me seemed suspicious?" Bradshaw hesitated, his grip tightening around his belt. His usual confidence wavered under the weight of Samuel Carter's steady gaze. The crowd had grown larger now, phones still recording, waiting for the officer's next move. He could feel the eyes of every bystander drilling into him, their silent judgment louder than any words they could say. But his pride wouldn't let him admit his mistake. Instead, he scoffed. "You were acting like you had something to hide," he muttered. Samuel's lips pressed into a thin line. "And by that you mean, what? Driving a nice car? Wearing a suit?" His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the challenge in his words. Bradshaw's jaw tightened. He had walked into a trap of his own making, and there was no easy way out. Just then, another patrol car pulled up. A second officer, Sergeant Miller, stepped out, his expression shifting from confusion to concern as he took in the scene. "Bradshaw," he called out, his tone firm but cautious. "What's going on here?" Bradshaw straightened his shoulders, grasping at control. "Suspicious behavior. I was just handling it." Miller's eyes flicked to Samuel, then to the FBI badge still glinting in his hand. He swallowed hard. "Bradshaw, we need to talk." Bradshaw's pulse pounded in his ears as Miller pulled him aside, his voice low but urgent. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with?" Miller hissed, glancing back at Samuel, who stood calmly, watching them with an unreadable expression. The crowd remained silent, their phones still recording every second. The weight of the situation pressed down on Bradshaw, but he refused to show weakness. He was acting suspicious. Bradshaw repeated stubbornly, his voice edged with frustration. But even as he said the words, they felt hollow. He could see the doubt in Miller's eyes, the way his shoulders stiffened as if bracing for what was to come. Samuel took a step forward, his presence commanding. "Sergeant, I assume you know how serious this is," he asked, his tone steady. Miller nodded quickly. "Yes, sir, I do." But Bradshaw wasn't ready to back down. His pride, his career, everything felt like it was slipping through his fingers. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, shaking his head. "You're blowing this out of proportion." Samuel's expression remained calm, but his eyes darkened. "Am I?" he asked. "Because from where I'm standing, you just put your badge, your career, and your future on the line. And now the whole world is watching." A hush fell over the street as Samuel's words hung in the air. Bradshaw's breathing grew shallow, his mind racing for a way out. But before he could speak, the sound of an approaching vehicle cut through the tension. A sleek black sedan rolled up to the curb, its tinted windows concealing whoever was inside. The back door opened, and out stepped a tall man in a crisp suit, his expression unreadable. Miller's face went pale. "Oh no," he muttered under his breath. Samuel turned slightly, nodding at the newcomer. "I was wondering when you'd show up," he said. Bradshaw's confusion deepened as the man approached with deliberate steps. His gaze landed on the officer, piercing and cold. "Officer Bradshaw," he said smoothly, his voice carrying authority. "I assume you're aware of who you just detained." Bradshaw swallowed hard, but lifted his chin. "I was just doing my job." The man let out a quiet chuckle, but there was no amusement in it. "Your job," he repeated. "Because from where I'm standing, you just detained and assaulted a high-ranking federal agent." He reached into his pocket, pulling out another badge, one even Miller instantly recognized. The air grew heavier. This wasn't just about an FBI agent anymore. It was much bigger than that. And Bradshaw had just made things even worse. Bradshaw felt his stomach drop as the weight of the situation finally sank in. The man standing before him wasn't just any federal official. He was someone with the power to end Bradshaw's career with a single phone call. The officer's confidence wavered as he glanced at Miller, who looked just as shaken. Samuel crossed his arms, his gaze locked onto Bradshaw. "So tell me, officer," he said, his voice calm but sharp. "Still think you were just doing your job?" Bradshaw swallowed hard, his mind scrambling for an excuse, a way to explain himself. But there was nothing he could say that would undo what had already been done. The crowd around them whispered, their phones still recording every second. The world was watching, and there was no escaping this. Then, just when it seemed like the worst had come, the suited man's phone rang. He answered, listening carefully before nodding. "Understood," he said before tucking the phone away. He turned back to Bradshaw, his expression unreadable. "Lucky for you," he said slowly, "Agent Carter has decided not to press charges." Bradshaw exhaled in relief, but Samuel wasn't finished. "That doesn't mean there won't be consequences," he added. "Your department will be hearing from us." As Samuel turned to leave, Bradshaw's relief was short-lived. The damage was done. His career, his reputation, everything he thought he controlled was now slipping through his fingers. And in that moment, he realized karma had already done its job. As the black sedan pulled away, the weight of what had just happened settled heavily on Bradshaw's shoulders. The once confident officer now stood frozen, his mind replaying every mistake he had made. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but not before throwing him a few lingering glances, some disappointed, others satisfied that justice had been served in its own way. The videos were already making their rounds online, and deep down, he knew his career would never be the same. Miller sighed, placing a hand on Bradshaw's shoulder. "You really messed up," he muttered, shaking his head. "This isn't going away." Bradshaw didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Samuel Carter watched for a moment before slipping his badge back into his coat pocket. He didn't gloat, didn't rub it in. He simply gave Bradshaw one last look, a silent warning. Then without another word, he walked away. As Bradshaw stood there, his uniform feeling heavier than ever, reality sank in. His power, his authority, it had all been built on the wrong foundation. And now, for the first time, he understood what it felt like to be truly powerless. Karma had spoken, and this time it had been swift.